Women's Aid report lately, so I'm asking a question on that in relation to what you're going to do, given the significant increase in contacts with Women's Aid, that 44% of the women said they were not satisfied with their initial engagement with the Garda Síochána, and also that the response is inconsistent from the Guards in relation to the 65,000 contacts received. And so what steps are you taking in relation to the zero tolerance policy of the government? Cormac.
Minister.
Yeah, I want to thank Deputy Connolly for her question, and as she knows, the Women's Aid report was published last week. I had the privilege and I suppose responsibility as well in terms of being at the launch and launching it. The statistics within it are very concerning. There's 32,144 contacts was made to Women's Aid services last year, a 12% increase on the previous year. I also was aware, Deputy, of the, I suppose, the statistic contained within it that 44% of women were not satisfied with the response they got in the first instance from An Garda Síochána. And obviously, notwithstanding the fact that the majority are satisfied, I think it does indicate that there's an issue there in terms of ensuring that Gardaí are suitably and adequately qualified in responding to the scourge of domestic violence. I have to say, my own assessment and advice I've got from within Garda Síochána and indeed from people who are victims of domestic violence is that once the victim gets engaged with, I suppose, the experts within Garda Síochána who are extensively trained in domestic violence, they have a very positive outcome, and I think that's apparent when you look at the response from people outside court where there has been a successful conviction. Obviously, it's imperative that we ensure there is adequate and sufficient training for Gardaí in the whole area of domestic violence and coercive control. And I just want you to know, in phase 1 of the training at Templemore, trainee Gardaí complete 34 hours of instruction on domestic and sexual crime investigation, with dedicated classes on domestic abuse investigation in phases 2 and 3. Trainees in Templemore receive an online presentation on the basics of domestic violence investigation, where the importance of positive first contact with victims is highlighted. It's also the case that trainees attend an in-person workshop on the Domestic Violence Act 2018 and in Garda Síochána policy on domestic abuse intervention. At the 9-week operational stage, trainee Gardaí assume an observational role attached to Garda stations. So there is training there, but certainly there needs to be greater improvement, Deputy.
Deputy.
Thanks, Minister. I followed this up myself since I came here in 2016, but going back, we had a task force in 96, 97. Edna Fitzgerald was the Labour Minister at that stage. And ever since, we've been playing catch-up. And so I'm not reassured that the Guards have now courses going. It's acknowledged by the Guards when they're before us on the public accounts recently that and they're going to send further details in relation to the improvements that they're going to make. The Women's Aid tell us the services are overstretched and underfunded. I'm actually losing words here because I've spoken about it so often. The level of violence is horrific. We should drop the word domestic. There aren't even refuges in each county. And that's a wrong way to be going in a sense. We have to go that way, but that's removing the woman from the house as opposed to the offender. One of the top recommendations back with the task force that we needed to have an intervention strategy in relation to the perpetrator. That has absolutely never happened, while the figures have just grown exponentially, despite all the strategies, despite all the legislation.
Thank you, Minister.
Deputy, as you'll be well aware, this is a societal problem. My own assessment of it, however, is that there is a growing recognition of the extent of this problem, and there's a greater sense of confidence and capacity on the part of women no longer to tolerate this and therefore to report it. It's a debate as to whether or not the increased numbers are due to an increase in violence, as you say, against women, or whether it's to do with a greater sense of confidence and security about coming forward. It's probably an alignment of both, I regret to say. Certainly in terms of the increase in violence against women, you know, that is something that seems to be driven from the presentation on social media to young men and to boys as to how relationships should develop in a completely malign and repulsive way. So that we need to keep an eye on what's happening with with boys and young men in terms of what they're being exposed to online. But I have to say, I think the attitude of society and the attitude of politics and the attitude of people in this House to domestic violence has remarkably changed, and in terms there is a strong resistance to tolerating it any further. And the Gardaí, I think, are doing a good job in respect of it.
Deputy.
I disagree with you. I think the Guards are doing a good job with the protective units, absolutely. I disagree with you that things have changed in terms of societal attitudes. You can do certain things, and you can act very quickly, Minister. You can act in relation to a register that you've promised, and you've given me no timeline in relation to that, the domestic violence register. Women's Aid have consistently expressed that the strongest legislation won't make a difference, even if it's enforced without a complete overhaul of our approach to domestic, I'm not going to use the word domestic, to violence, to crime, and absolute mandatory training for the Guards at every level. We shouldn't be in the 21st century where we're talking about protective units that are good, but the general body of the Guards haven't got mandatory training in relation to this. The family law needs to be overhauled. It's described by Women's Aid and by organisations on the ground that are expert on this, that it's disempowering. It's adding to the abuse when they go through this process. So there are practical things that you can do now, Minister, as the new Minister, that will make a difference.
Thank you, Minister.
Deputy, there is mandatory training for trainees down in Templemore, and I outlined it earlier on in the answer. Second, in terms of the register, I've instructed officials in my department to prepare heads of amending bill to the Domestic Violence Act, and that's the name of the piece of legislation, but in order to ensure that persons who are convicted of serious offences on indictment can have the detail of that published in court judgments, which will be a decision that can be made by the judges hearing the case. So there are efforts being made, and as you know, I've got permission from government, and it's in the process of being drafting at present the amendment to the counselling notes. That's going to be contained within the Criminal Law Miscellaneous Provisions Bill. And there's other provisions as well in terms of sex for rent that I have brought forward legislation to respond to, and in terms of this register here, and indeed the Guardianship of Infants Act, which has been amended. I've got permission from government to bring forward legislation. That too will show to men that there is a consequence to the violence that they engage in against women.